everyone. We're going to look at funding in education and see how education can be funded differently depending on the circumstances. We're going to look at two major things that have occurred. One will be the Rankin County, Mississippi bond proposal, and we'll look at that briefly. And then we're going to look at a federal study that happened 3 years ago that looked at federal funding and public funding of school districts across the nation and where we stand as that. Funding is always an important issue because when you examine funding, you see that a lot of money is poured into the education systems. With that said, education systems as a whole have taxpayer resistance. Taxpayers feel like they give a lot of money, but they don't really see much results. This happens a lot, especially when the economy is bad. When the economy is bad, people say, well, I want to see more bang for my buck. If you'll think back to your other lectures in other courses, education is funded mainly at the state level. It's largely funded at the state level because that's how our founding fathers wanted it to be funded. Our founding fathers wanted, with the 10th Amendment, education to be the responsibilities of the states. They do provide federal funding opportunities, but those are usually with the Title I, and mainly they're done in limited areas. In 2011, the Rankin County School District, located near Jackson, Mississippi, decided to try to pass a bond. Now, a bond goes beyond what the school systems want. The school systems are funded mainly through property taxes. And when you have property taxes, what you end up having is people pay money based on how much their land is worth. So if you have a very wealthy house, you pay more money. The school districts can also make a little bit extra money by sales tax, and that is usually through the state. One area is that school districts can have increased money is the concept of what's called bonds. Bonds go above and beyond property tax. What a bond is the school district or any organization can sell bonds to investors. Weekly, W-E-A-K, weak bonds that are not guaranteed to be paid back become what is known as junk bonds. So there's actually a bond market that persons can invest in, much like the stock market. So what you would do is, let's say your sells potato chips, and your company wishes to get more money from investors. You can sell what are known as bonds. Now, if your company does not think that they can pay it back, other investors and rating services will rate them an A or a B or category such as that by looking at the financials. Which means if I, as an investor, want to buy that bond, I can receive a return of, say, 5 or 6%, or maybe even less or more after a period of, say, 6 months to a year, kind of like a CD or a treasury bill. Now, a treasury bill is backed by the United States government, and that's why treasury bills usually have lower return rates. So if you have $1,000 and you buy a treasury bill, you may get 1 to 5%. The reason for that is no matter what, your treasury bill will mature after 1 year, and it's backed by the United States government. Because it's backed by the United States, we pretty much know the United States government will be here in a year. So it is a very safe investment. A CD at a bank is even more safe, or safer, because the CD is backed by the bank, but the bank may not be there in a year. That's why the banks are insured by the FDIC, which is the Federal Deposit Insurance Company, which is backed by our government. So if you invest in a CD at a bank, You're insured by the not only the bank, but mainly by the government. So as long as the government does not default, your CD or your treasury bill will always be there and ready to pay you back after it matures. Now, that is a CD and a treasury bill, very safe investments. A riskier investment would be a bond. A bond is sold by companies, other governments, and even schools and counties can sell bonds. Now, these bonds are a way for the school district or the county or any other unit to get a loan, a fast loan from investors. Of course, for example, let's use a school district as an example. A school district such as Rankin County could sell the bonds on the bond market and they could raise $100 million. So they sell $100 million in bonds on the bond market. They're going to want the lowest rate possible. They're going to want a 1 or 2% bond. Many people won't buy that bond. So they're probably going to have like a 2 or 3% bond. That's how that works. So they try to get the lowest percentage while the investors try to get the highest percentage. But also, school bonds are pretty safe. School districts really do not default on their bonds, so those rates are going to be pretty safe. So they're probably going to get an A rating on that bond. Now, you may ask yourself, well, how does the school district pay it back? They pay it back with tax money. So a school district such as Rankin County may have a $100 million budget. Well, they don't have $100 million liquid to buy a new building. So they will pass a bond, which is a way they can take a loan out for $100 million. And then over 6 months to a year, they can pay back that bond and the interest that's required by the investors. Now, of course, a junk bond would have a higher rate of return, 10 to 20% sometimes. But, of course, with a junk bond, they may default. The company may go bankrupt, and therefore your investment is gone. So the junk bond in the bond market is a way that companies, governments, cities, everybody who meets the qualifications of a bond can receive a loan and pay it back. Investors flock to the bond market because they give you low and safe returns as well as risky returns, and that may not pay out at all if the company goes under. So that's how the bonds work. School districts such as Rankin County attempt to pass bond issues. Now, how do they pass a bond issue? A school district, a superintendent can't just run out there and say, I want to buy up I want to sell some bonds. Well, that doesn't happen because you really can't do that without voter approval. So many school districts will go around and they'll ask the voters to pass a bond referendum. Of course, when the voters are doing this, they are agreeing that they will pay back the bond. The school district can't pay back the bond without revenue, and the revenue, it comes from increased taxes, which are known as millage rates. And millage rates go on your property. So really what the school district is doing, let's break it down to just a very simple way, is the school district makes their money off property taxes. But they can increase property taxes, but to increase property taxes, they can only do it so much a year. Also, that makes voters mad when you increase property taxes. They also have to justify why they're increasing property taxes. They can't just increase it for no reason. They actually have to show that there's a reason behind it. I think they can only also increase it a couple of mills every year anyway. What the school district and the community is doing is they are volunteering to increase their property taxes until the bond is paid off. What does the school district get in return? The school district receives a large amount of money, which will then be used for whatever the bond issue was told by the people. So if you pass a $10 million bond for a new bridge, your county is asking $10 million to build a bridge. So the taxpayers want the bridge to be built. That's how it is. So before you pass the bond, most voters want to know what their money is going for. Bond issues, for the most part, are successful if they're done right. and you have to get the voters on board. Rankin County attempted to pass a bond, and this bond stated the following. This was their project cost. They, of course, were saying, we don't know how much. See, these estimates are very preliminary, and it's based on current construction cost. Meaning, now, let's say, their bond total was down here. They was asking for a bond of $169 million paid for by the taxpayers. $169 million. Now, let's say you're going to build a new school for $169 million. And costs go up. According to the law, you cannot change that $169 million, which means if I'm going to build a shed, a school, or a shed or a building for $169 million, and the construction worker says, hey, the roof's going to cost more money, then you can't increase the bond. It is only whatever the voters approve. So sometimes with bond issues, people get upset because they're promised a lot of stuff, but with construction, you're only given so much. So usually whenever you're going to do a bond, you kind of want to predict a little high. That way with construction costs, they always fluctuate. But what usually happens is if the bond is passed, then the county knows or the school district knows that they have X amount of money coming no matter what, because it's coming. And they can go ahead and start sending out bids. And a bunch of construction companies will bid to build something, and they usually bid, like some will bid low and some will bid high, and the schools try to pick the best bond, the best construction company to meet that bond issue. And once they sign the contract, then the construction company is locked into that rate. So these are estimates, but they're estimates as much as they could based on current construction costs. And many times the school districts will go ahead and draw up the plans, and they'll drop all that. For the Rankin County School District, they have different school zones. For the Brandon zone, which has 5,286 students, and it says that the new Brand High School was built in 2001 by bond funds. So they're kind of putting that there saying, look, the school district was built by bond issues. So now the school district's going to have to be redone. Brandon High School is going to receive 16 new classrooms at a price of $4 million. They will receive a new football stadium, a field house, girls softball and soccer practice field. And I believe that line is supposed to say that was going to be $10 million. This is something that definitely caught the voters a little upset about, was a new football stadium and field house was going to cost $10 million. Brandon Middle School was going to receive 12 new classrooms at $3 million. They were going to renovate the gym, replace the elevator, and repair a canopy for $2 million. Brandon Elementary was going to receive $15 million. They say for a new elementary school. So if you look at this, the one big thing that made people a little upset that I have read is the idea that it was going to cost $10 million for a new gym and new football field. The Florence School District, which has 2,400, and it says Steen was built by a 2001 bond issue. They're kind of putting that there because they're kind of saying, look, y'all, these school districts were built with a bond, so they have to be redone by a bond. That's what they're kind of saying, which is understandable. The Florence High School is going to receive 13 new classrooms for $3 million with a science lab. The band hall was going to run $850,000. And they're going to add a baseball and softball dressing room, renovate the locker rooms and lighting in the gym, and upgrade the football stadium for $2.8 million. Florence Middle School, 6 new classrooms, including 3 science labs, practice football field, destroy the old gym and the old classroom building for $3.6 million. Florence Elementary School, 6 new classrooms, renovate the restrooms and covered walkway for $2.7 million. In Steens Elementary, 5 new classrooms, a new playground, and have frontage roads for $1.9 million, about $2 million. You can put the numbers however you want to. That's $2 million. The McLaren zone has 1,287. They're going to build a new high school for grades 9 through 12, including a new girls' softball field, concession stand with restrooms at the football field, for $24 million. Northwest Rankin Zone, current student enrollment, North Shore and Oakland Middle built with 2001 bond issues. Northwest Rankin was going to build a new high school for grades 10 through 12 at $47 million. And they're going to renovate the existing Northwest Rankin High School for grades 8 through 9. So you can see that there's a growth issue at Northwest Rankin, that they was going to actually build a new school. That's a major growing thing. 47 million, that'd be real nice. Northwest Rankin Zone Elementary Schools was going to re-roof Northwest Rankin Elementary for $1.2 million. As you scroll down, you see even more. Instead of going through all these line by line, you definitely see they're going to renovate the gym at Pelahatchie for $1.3 million. 4 new classrooms and a playground for $1.4 million. At Pisgah, they're going to renovate 11 high school classrooms and renovate the library. New agricultural building in JROTC for $1 million. Richland was going to receive 2 new classrooms. They was going to also add bleachers, press box, and lights to football field and renovate baseball dugouts for $400,000. They're going to install an entry card system to all school districts for $850,000. You also notice something there, it says contingency. A reserve fund for unexpected increases was going to be $19 million. That's a very large contingency fund. Professional fees were going to be at $3 million, meaning I don't know what that was. They just don't have an explanation for that. And total estimated cost was $169 million for this bond issue. The bond issue went up for vote, and it was voted on in September of 2011, and it was denied. Residents were waiting to see Rankin County School District's next move after a proposed $169.5 million bond issue failed at the polls on Tuesdays. Nearly 10,000 voters, or 60% of the ballots cast, disapproved of the issue. This was a contrast to the district's last issue 10 years ago, 2001, which they kept mentioning, in which 82% of the districts approved. So Rankin County has a history of approving funding for school districts, especially when it comes around with bond issues. However, there is resistance on this one. More than 16,000 votes. Voters are roughly 22% of those registered cast ballots on the issue Tuesday. When the board met Wednesday morning, Ann Sturdivant, president of the district's board, said the bond issue wasn't discussed as far as where do we go from here. We have not discussed backup plans, which means they don't really know what to do. A Brandon resident, Paul Dawson, who actively campaigned against the bond issue, said that the district would probably got away with a $50 or $60 million bond. But first, the school board needed to look at the difference between a need and a want. Oh, that's very important. As for considering a smaller bond issue, Sturdivant said she didn't think that there was any question the board will have to do just that. I'm only one vote on the board, but I would like to think that we have to address only the critical needs. So now she's backing off, saying that we need to get away from this. Brandon High School has been open only 6 years and it needs 16 new classrooms. Well, yes, that's what she says. At issue, the budget is a wasteful spending. A $9 million district office building that opened in 2009 off US 80. Also, allegations of the district paying $80,000 for pine straw that was never delivered earlier this year. The school board isn't trusted to be financially responsible, Busan said. Amy Garland said she voted for the bond issue because she knows the schools in her Northwest Rankin zone are too crowded. But I'm hearing others talk about their frustrations with the district, she said, pointing out that the district's office building made its way into more than one conversation she's had with friends. So there's one big issue that we're seeing that's declining this bond, is people are upset with a district office that was built for $800,000. I want the schools to have new buildings, she says. I did have reservations about voting for the bond, but I don't want to punish the kids for the actions of the district. I think the board overstepped its bounds, says Reservoir Area resident Tony Bagu, saying he voted against the issue in part because some of the funds going towards a proposed athletic upgrade at Brandon and a proposed $19 million cost contingency, which we had mentioned. But the new athletic facilities were among the things Brandon had wanted, Starvart said. We had a safety issue because students were having to be transported back and forth from the middle school. Some residents believe the fields were a breaking point for many voters. I think it'll pass if they streamline the bond and cut the fat. District officials said the bond issue was the only way to fund construction projects needed throughout the district's 8 school zones. I knew that because of the economy. The bond issue wouldn't pass by 80%. But I believe I was in shock Tuesday night. When businesses and individuals are always thinking of a transfer, they have always looked at the Rankin County School District. This will also affect people, she says, who are trying to sell their homes. There aren't going to be as many people wanting to move to the area. So this is a simple article about a Rankin School District attempting to pass a bond that was unsuccessful. Now, you may be emotional about this because you may be part of the school district or not. However, you definitely see that the bond issue is always very delicate. The next thing we want to look at is, well, we've talked about funding on a local level, and you see how this becomes very emotional when people actually drive over to a polling place to vote against a bond. Let's now look at an article about funding, about basic funding of schools nationwide. We're not looking at just bond issues, but just looking at how states cut the check. This is an article that says, "Is School Funding Fair a National Report Card?" It was made by 3 educators who wanted to review the fundings of the nation. So let's examine this page by page and see how funding is across the nation. And their question is school funding fair? This article talks about who they are and their positions. I've underlined some passages and then I scanned it so we can go through this. I'll also put this on the front page of my courses so that you can have access to it. It says that the key to economic prosperity is education. We all know this. This is one of our basic point of it. If not closing long-standing and stubborn gaps in achievement, they exist among subgroups of the nation's students. So the article says that there are gaps, there are differences in our socio-economic statuses. And what it's kind of suggesting is that there are differences in poverty, which is obvious. That when we need to close these gaps. Meeting the equal opportunity challenge in education requires funding all public schools at levels sufficient to provide a rigorous curriculum. So they're saying we need to have equal funding. Concentrated student poverty in schools generates greater needs that in turn require resources to support effective programs and strategies such as high-quality early education. And that's where the article kind of makes a suggestion that, and this is one thing they're going to look at, is concentrated levels of poverty. We would call these inner cities or the Delta region, in which people of any group are concentrated and poor together. The next paragraph says, of course, funding alone cannot be, and they're saying that this is not the solution to all. However, high poverty schools need sufficient funds, effectively used to achieve established outcome goals and prepare their students for high school graduation and for post-secondary education or the workforce. So how we fund the education is definitely something important. That's just our introduction page, very good introduction page, and it walks us through where this study is going to go. They continue on. 2 features dominate the landscape of public education and heavily influence them. decentralization and concentrated student poverty. So those two things, let's look at that first sentence right there. Decentralization and concentrated student poverty. What decentralization means is that the states run education, not the federal government. And because the federal government is centralized, the states are decentralized. And you look at that when I wrote fact right here. There are 16,000 school districts in our 50 states, 100,000 separate schools. Now, of course, we cannot have one school in one school district, but that's what they're saying, that there are a lot of separate school districts, and that's why it's decentralized. So therefore, the formulas delivered to fund the school districts are complex in nature. And that's why the article couldn't look into that. Because you cannot take 16,000 school districts and examine the funding of all 16,000 school districts. Well, that'd be a huge project. And that's something they couldn't do. These formulas deliver some combination of state and local revenues, which we know. So we can pause here and definitely look at that. The state can receive their money in many different ways. But the main way the state receives their money, besides passing bonds that we've talked about, is the way of sales tax. The state makes a little money, well, they make a little off the idea of property tax. Well, they have taxes such as that. They have income tax as well. The state you have to file your taxes for income tax. But the state mainly makes their money off sales tax. And that's how they do it. So the state does that. They have property, they have income, they have car tax, decals, every other little fee they can imagine. But the way the states do their formulas vary, definitely. The most recent national data show the state share at 46%, the local share at 44%. So if you look at that, very important element right there. The states, on average, pay 46.5% to the school district, and the school district pays 44%. So that's pretty huge. So when you hear of a local school district, property taxes usually make up about 44% of that. Here's our first mention of the state of Mississippi, which says that state K-12 public education systems face the challenges of educating extraordinary high numbers of students in poverty. Using the U.S. Census standard, the national average for child poverty in the nation's public schools is 16%. 9 states have the child poverty rates of 20%, and of course, Mississippi leads the way at 26%. So we'll take a pause right there and remember that when we're looking at poverty, there's only really one standard for poverty, and that is the U.S. Census standard, which many people say it can be skewed because they usually say that one standard. They also don't look at geographical. They don't look at how much things cost. So if you live, for example, in the Mississippi Delta, where the expense of land is high, sales tax is sometimes a little low. The cost of living is not that high. Also, daycare is the lowest in the nation. Mississippians pay about $4,800 in daycare compared to Washington, D.C., which pays $20,000 in daycare a year. So the census does not look at that. The census looks at how much do you make, and then they set the poverty line. So Mississippi has the most people under poverty school age at 26%. While the census poverty rate differentiates above and below. 11 states have averaged what they call FRL rates over 50%, with Mississippi being the highest at 68%. So Mississippi, we can conclude, has a high rate of poverty no matter how you look at it. Even more striking than child and student poverty rates is the extent to which poverty is concentrated. Meaning, when you have groups or pockets of people who are poor in one area. Mississippi serves 1/3 of its students in these high poverty schools. So Mississippi has 1/3 of their students in high poverty schools. So poverty in Mississippi is concentrated. Let's look at this slide right here. This says that it has the school district, the number enrolled, and the amount of people below the poverty line. So look at just Alabama. Alabama has 6 school districts that have 59,000 people enrolled, and that's how many under 10%. So what they said is, okay, Alabama, how many school districts do you have where 10% or less of your students are below the poverty line? They have 6 school districts which have under 10% poverty. They have 30 school districts with 10 to 20%, 69 with 20 to 30%. Over 30, 20. So you see that the enrollment percentage is very large. 48% of Alabama students, 20 to 30% in poverty, are in those school districts. So in layman's terms, if you're a poor student below the federal poverty line, in all likelihood, you're going to a school which is full of students below the poverty line. Let's look at Mississippi. Mississippi has 63 school districts. Look on the far right. 63 school districts. 33% of our students statewide are in school districts where 30% or more are below the poverty line. That is amazing. 33% of our students attend schools where more than 30% of the student body is below the poverty line. I can't break it down more simple than that. But that's one reason. This chart right here is showing you why poorness is concentrated. Below the poverty line is concentrated in just a handful of schools. Now, of course, Mississippi, we know where that would be. That's called the Delta. Obviously, it's the Delta. It makes up 1/3 of our state. The article then talks about, it gives a brief review of LIT, where it says there has been many attempts at this before, and it says that there's several reports have attempted to analyze state school funding systems. These are the National Center for Education Statistics, Education Week, Education Trust. So this is kind of a review of LIT, in which they're saying other reports have attempted to look at funding systems. It then discusses some limitations of the study, which is fine. This is the methods section of the paper. That's what I consider the methods section. It says report card is built on the following principles, and it talks about those. That student poverty, especially concentrated student poverty, is the most critical variable affecting funding levels. Student and school poverty correlates with and is a proxy for a multitude of factors that impact upon the cost of providing equal education opportunity. While the distribution of funding to account for student poverty is critical, the overall level of funding still matters greatly. The state finance system would allocate sufficient funding to ensure equal education opportunity to all students if the overall level of funding generated by the state system is woefully inadequate. They then put some instruments up here on how they're going to measure this. And they look at, so instead of reading all that, I'll break it down for you. They're going to take and you'll see this when we look at the top charts. They're going to take the data from the poverty lines and how much the school district, all the data they've collected, and they're going to break it down on 4 categories. One is a basic funding level, which is the measure of the overall level of the state and local revenue provided to school districts. Then the funding distribution, which measures the distribution of funding across local school districts within the state. effort, how hard is the state paying based on their GDP? And then the final category is coverage, which means proportion of poor to rich and all that. We'll break this down as we look at each chart, which is coming up. So now this method is different and new for this research study. So what they're saying is all other research studies have just said, and it's real simple, I've always said this one, that Mississippi school districts pay a lot of money. We pay a lot of money to our students. We give $7,000 or $8,000 a year to each of our students. So that's it. So we're doing the best we can. But this study is going to look at how much each state's paying, how hard it is for the pocketbook, how it's affecting students who are poor in school districts. They're going to break it down. So these four categories are created by the researchers. They're trying to create a better and more fairer way to interpret the data. So instead of just saying Washington, D.C. pays out $12,000 for the school districts per child, they're actually going to look at it more in depth. The research method, they went through the statistics real simple like that. So let's look at the actual numbers. They looked at data from 2005 to 2007, which is still fresh, and it really hasn't changed that much. It may have changed a little bit since the economic downturn, but hopefully I don't really think. This is a longitudinal study, which means that they came back at it several different times. They looked at it from 2005 to 2007. So, for example, if Mississippi increased in 2005, how much we paid, but then in 2006 we pulled back, they were going to catch that. So this wasn't just going to be a snapshot. They were going to look at it for over 3 years, from 2005 to 2007. They're going to look at all those years to make sure that each states weren't changing things up. So they decided to evaluate the states. Each state is evaluated on all four fairness measures, okay, obviously. Now, they did two separate things, which is kind of cool. They did what's called the normal bell-shaped curve, and that's this right here. I drew it right here whenever I was reading this article. So what they did was they kind of dumbed down statistics. That's why I wrote down dumbing down stats. Because we all understand what the bell-shaped curve is. The bell-shaped curve is a natural distribution of scores where it revolves around the mean. So, for example, if you look at that chart, C is the mean. So the average would be in the middle. And the better school districts would be towards A and B. So instead of saying one standard deviation or two standard deviations, they decided to kind of dumb it down. And they said, okay, A, B, C, D, and F. So the A, B, C, D, or F, many people say, well, how did my school district get a C? Well, this is why they're doing it. They take all the states, they look at all the funding, and they put them across a chart. And they say, okay, if you're at the very top here on the curve, you're an A. If you're in the middle, you're a C. And if you're at the bottom, you're an F or a D. So that's what they did. That's why I wrote down dumbing down stats, because it's kind of dumbing it down. Instead of saying, okay, Mississippi is -1 standard deviation or 1.4 standard deviations above or below the mean, they're actually going to say, okay, it's A, B, C, D, F. But now you understand where it came from. It's kind of a cool thing to do. So they decided to look at the first thing. The first thing they looked at was fairness. Fairness of the funding. Funding level. The funding level, number one. So the first fairness measure was the overall level of peer pupil funding for each state. Several major factors influence the level of state funding. They are student poverty, regional wage. They looked at this. In the model, in turn, estimates the impact of these factors. So here's the model right here. So they looked at all of this. Child poverty rates, and they did their little economic scale times population density, regional wage variation, and then language proficiency, disability, and mobility. They put all that together, and then they get per pupil, state and local revenues per pupil. To measure the funding level, state and local education revenues are adjusted to the national average poverty level. So they put this huge calculation in, and they had the table 2 shows the mean actual state and local revenue per child. So what they did was they took the funding. So let's say Mississippi says, well, in our state we give $9,000 to the school district per child. Well, many states won't say that. So what they did was they took each dollar and they made each dollar really mean something. So they took this formula, and here's where it came up to. So this is actually taking funding and making it equal. So even though you're a rich school and you rich state, and you pay $20,000, let's put it on an equal footing. Mean actual. This is actually how much they pay. And local revenue per pupil. Wyoming is $16,000. Predicted is local revenues is $16,900. Difference is 4%. They rank number 1. Which means Wyoming pays $16,000 to $16,238 cash money every year per child. That's how it works. But so that's what this means. So this isn't anything influenced. That's the check. The next column is this whole table here, which means calculating to make the money equal across the nation. So if you have a large number of child poverty rates, if you have a large disability, mobility, economics to scale, then that means the predicted value is $16,900. Which means that Wyoming pays a lot of money, even though that they are unable to pay a lot of money because of different reasons. So that's why they are ranked number 1. New Jersey pays $17,000, but because of all the other rates, their really actual mean is $16,101. So that ends up being a minus 16. They're ranked number 2. So the first column is how much you actually pay. The second column is how much, if you factor in all their formula, that your money is really paying to start with. Real simple process. So, of course, you're looking at this and you're immediately thinking, what about Mississippi? And how's Mississippi doing? So as we look at Mississippi, we start really thinking about that. So we scroll down and we see, where will we be? No, not there. There we are. 45th. We pay $7,102 per child. And if you factor in, you put us on the equal playing field with the rest of the nation, that would be the equivalent of $7,444, which means we are 47th in the nation. Tennessee's last. Interesting. The national average funding level as adjusted is $10,000, which means we're $3,000 adjusted below the nation. So even though with the adjusted, even though you're a poor state, the adjusted shows that we're not paying much. The state with the highest funding level, Wyoming, and so it provides about 2.5 times the funding provided by the state with the lowest funding. So Wyoming pays 2.5, almost 2.5 what Tennessee when you compare them with the adjusted. So that's the first thing they looked at. And that's what many states just stop at, especially that first column. Many times you don't see that second column. The first column, definitely, you see that and you go, oh, okay, Mississippi pays $7,000. But then people always counter with, well, Mississippi doesn't make much money. But this shows you that even with an adjusted rate, we're almost $3,000 below what we should be paying. Mississippi should be paying $10,000 per student. That's what should happen. So whenever someone says, just a final note, whenever someone says Mississippi pays $7,000, but it's not the same. We make less money here. We really should be paying about $10,000 national average. Now, with that said, it's not all bad news. The second fairness measure was the distribution of funding to districts within states. So, how was the money spread among the school districts? There's a good thing right there. So, for example, Hawaii and the District of Columbia, they're not included because Hawaii only has one school district. So, what we're looking at with this chart is how, when they cut the $7,000 check or the $10,000 check, how is it spread across the school districts? And we're going to look at the different school districts by looking at the poverty level. So, look at the first state, Utah. Utah has $6,586. For the very wealthy schools, they pay $5,700. For the very poor schools, they pay more money, 151% more. So they are paying more money towards the underperforming poor schools, which is what this study says you should do. So they receive an A for that. Mississippi, as we scroll down, does what we've always done. And if you look at that, Mississippi equally distributes, not too much. Mississippi pays $7,600 to school districts that have a 0% poverty rate, and they pay $305 less to school districts that have a 30% poverty rate, which is that's why Mississippi gets a C. So Mississippi is kind of flat, but we're kind of skewed a little bit down. So Mississippi, we really want to just pay a flat rate minus a little bit. Which one is the worst state? New Hampshire. Look at that. New Hampshire pays $13,000 to school districts that have a 0% poverty rate, and they only pay $8,000 to the very poor schools. And it kind of shows you what the ABCDF looks like. Only 14 states have progressive funding systems. So that's a key word they use there, progressive funding systems. And what progressive funding systems mean is the poorer the school district, the more money they receive. Now, of course, you may argue, well, if they're poor, they shouldn't receive more money. But this research says that poor school districts that have a lot of poor students, need more funding. Mississippi doesn't even have a flat system. It says 20 states have a regressive funding. 20 states actually pay less money to school districts with a higher poor population. 14 states have a flat system, which I would actually say Mississippi's very close to being flat. Mississippi is still skewed by 96% it said, but we're almost as flat as we can get. Progressive is more funds for lower poverty schools. The funding distribution measure can also be illustrated by a state fairness profile. The fairness profiles of 3 hypothetical states are displayed in Figure 6. So let me just show you what they do with this. This is what I was talking about. Mississippi, we're the bottom level right here. The bottom one, if I can't really highlight it, we're right here. There we go. Mississippi, if a 0% poverty line is at 7,000, and then we move down to the less than $308 right there. So we're almost flat, but we're not flat. But this would be close to being regressive, where you pay more money to the schools with less poverty. This is a truly regressive. If you'll notice that Connecticut's right here, and you can see that Connecticut's very disappointing. So that's what these charts are for, and they throw a lot of them at you. The third effect is how hard. Now, this is where Mississippi does well. How difficult is it for Mississippi to cut that check? That's $7,000. How difficult is it for Mississippi to pay the $7,600 to our school district? So what they did was they looked at gross domestic product, how much Mississippi produces, how much they sell, and they wanted to look at that. So how hard is the state working to cut that check? Bill Gates was worth $90 billion. So if I pull up my calculator and let's do some fancy math here. If you make $50,000 and you want to buy a Escalade, let's say Bill Gates makes $90 billion. Woo, that's a lot of zeros. So he wants to buy an Escalade. Let me write all these numbers down. So for Bill Gates, $50,000 to him, he's worth $90 billion divided by 50,000. That equals up to be, that's not right. I got something wrong. 90 billion divided by 50,000 equals 1.8 million. So, that's a lot. That's right. That's a lot. So if you do the math up, that equals to be that Bill Gates, when he wants to buy a $50,000 car, then that is the equivalent of, according to my scratch pad here, a half a penny to you. So if you make $50,000, to him is the equivalent of spending a half a penny. So that would be like you wanting to buy an Escalade with a half a penny. That's how much money he had. At $90 billion, $50,000 is the equivalent of a half a penny to you. So with that said, if you're a very wealthy school, very wealthy state, and you're spending $10,000 on education, then what's the effort? How hard is that for you to cut the check? So they wanted to look at state effort and look at the state effort. Mississippi is 19th. Mississippi, if you look at the per capita, then that would mean that we actually get a B. So we're doing okay. Our effort is very difficult. Now, of course, you see the big thing. Our effort index was 0.04. So that connects with the other thing right there. That definitely connects. Mississippi is paying $7,600. The average is $10,000. If we up ours to $10,000, our effort level would be an A. It's that simple. So Mississippi definitely ranks a B. We are paying a lot of money, but we definitely rank a B. Connecticut should be paying more and everything else, but that's how that works. Look at Delaware, South Louisiana, Tennessee. They're receiving ELFs. Oregon, Colorado, Washington, Arizona all receive ELFs as well. Oklahoma as well. So these are states that have more money, and they should be paying more. The last thing I looked at was coverage. This is something that's very, very interesting. I really like this. Was they wanted to see. Now, everyone understands that many of our students, our school-age students, do not go to the same schools, which means the struggle between public and private schools. Public versus private schools. Many of our students go to private schools. And this is something I've never seen before in our research study, but they said they wanted to see school-age children who attend the schools and how they receive that. So let's look at this chart. And it said, look at Wyoming. The percentage of 6 to 16-year-olds in public school. The median household income and the median household income for private school. And they give you a ratio there. So that means Wyoming has 93% of their students in public school. So 6.2% of their students go to private schools. The average salary of a family that are in public school in Wyoming is $73,000. So before we go to Mississippi, I want you to look at this and really understand this. So if you're in public school in Wyoming, the average salary is $73,000. If you're in private school, it's $92,000. So if you look at the difference, the ratio is 1.2, which that really should be about it. It's true. Private schools usually attract people with higher incomes. But let's look at Mississippi. Mississippi, 87% of our students go to public schools with an average income of $48,000. The rest are in private schools with 90. Look at the difference. Look at the big difference there. 94 and 48. So we have less students going to public schools, and we have a very wealthy, very large compared to other states, and that's why we're ranked 40th on here. So we see a disparity there. Definitely see a big difference there. Very interesting. more research needs to be done on that one. I thought that was very amazing that the average public school student is $48,000 in income. Now, I'm not saying that this is just stats. We're looking at research, but definitely if you look at private schools, the average is $94,000. They then kind of give you a breakdown on this chart for all the levels we've looked at. Look at Alabama has a funding distribution of D, effort C, funding level rank 33, and coverage rank was a 38. So they're not giving you one score. You know, Mississippi is a D or Mississippi is an F. Or anything. They're giving you scores over 4 categories. So I kind of like it better than just saying Mississippi does not fund education well. They actually give you a breakdown of that. Hawaii, they only have one school district. That's why they don't have a funding distribution level. Mississippi, to recap, we have a C, a B. We're 47th and 40th. So we definitely have room to improve. 6 states are positioned relatively well on all 4 measures. These states are, it says on funding distributions and rank, these states are Connecticut, Iowa, Massachusetts, New Jersey, Vermont, and Wyoming. Each of these states, however, need improvement in specific areas. For example, Connecticut and Iowa received C's for both funding. So if you look at all this, which state would be the best one to go to schooling in? Well, that is, listen, you 6 that need to, based on funding, are positioned well to improve. And these 6 states are, they show you right there, So very interesting finding. Most of these states have at least one area in which they could improve. 4 states receive below average ratings on all 4 indicators. So because of Mississippi's effort and our GDP, we actually are skipping that category. We're not in the 4 worst or the 4 most struggling. And those, of course, will be Louisiana, Illinois, Missouri, and North Carolina. So I'll put those down. So Mississippi, funding-wise, we're on the threshold of not paying or being in trouble, but our effort's good. So maybe we can work on some different areas. Digging deeper, it says it actually gives you a purpose statement of the research. It says the purpose of this research was to deepen the understanding of the public education stakeholders and policymakers about the conditions. Stakeholders, policymakers, and taxpayers often ask if fair school funding makes any difference. Future research, and this tells you where future research could go. Future research could explore the relationship between states with fair funding and their performance on student outcome measures. So you could take this data and springboard and look at state test results on national tests and see if there's a difference there. That's why I put gap in research. So that's where future research could definitely go after. I'll give you some charts as well here. Neither analysis shows that wealth and effort independently explain about the same degree of variation in state and local revenue per pupil. In other words, how wealthy a state isn't the factor on fairness. So if California is very wealthy, that doesn't mean that they're going to be fair in their distribution. Is there a better measure of student poverty? Most widely used was U.S. Census, and this is where they take the article and they kind of say, look, the U.S. Census may not be the best definition of poverty, but it's the only one we've got, and they're kind of suggesting that there may be other ways. And the biggest complaint they have is what I discussed earlier: is if you have just the U.S. Census poverty level, let's say poverty level is at $12,000, then it doesn't take into effect how people, cost of living and wages. Economics on scale remain a significant factor. Research shows that per pupil cost level of districts reach a scale-efficient enrollment size of 2,000 students. Only marginally federal funding. So it says, what about federal funding? What about money when it comes to federal funding? And it says, for most part, federal funding makes up only a small percentage of the states receive. And it says, mainly those are Title I funds, but for the most part, federal funding is very minimal when it looks at the school districts. So it's the responsibilities, or it's the job of the states to bring the federal funding in line. Can we expect fairness to improve in some states? Yes, it says. Several states have already instituted school funding reforms in 2006. And while most recent data will show that. Improving funding, it has some questions that they ask. In states, how's our state rank? And these are some questions. These three questions would be what states need to ask when they're talking about the budget and how they need to go and where they need to move from there. So if you're in the state legislative and you're saying, well, we need to talk about budget, they're saying, look, these are some questions you need to ask. A very interesting article. Talks about school funding. Our syllabus talks about, we need to discuss funding of schools. So I thought these articles would be very nice for that. So we definitely see that school funding is a big issue when it comes to schools. In this 1 hour lecture, I've shown you Rankin School District and how they're looking at bond issues, and I've also showed you a federal study. Well, it's kind of a study sponsored by the federal government, meaning they got grant money, to discuss and look at the nation as a whole. Very interesting article. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If not, you can send me an email. It'll be posted on the front page of my courses. Hope you enjoyed it. Let me close all this out.